Section 1. Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we settle into the long candlelit corridors of medieval castles, where stone walls echo with the clinking of goblets and the hushed murmurs of cloaked nobles. The scent. A thick, dizzying swirl of spiced wine, fire-roasted meats, and something slightly funky, like old cheese left too long on a pewter plate. You've stepped straight into a royal feast, not just any supper, but a medieval banquet where kings recline beneath velvet banners, their tables sagging under the weight of culinary excess. You're here now, but remember, they probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It begins with a roar, not from a dragon sadly, but from the great hearth blazing in the centre of the feasting hall. Flames crackle against iron spit rods, upon which whole animals turn slowly, boars, deer, and occasionally even peacocks, their feathers plucked only to be carefully reattached after roasting. Kings, you see, didn't just want to eat. They wanted to impress, and few things said, "I'm wealthier than you," like a roasted bird in full regalia. The banquet hall of a medieval king is less a dining room and more a theatre of political spectacle. Picture it. Hundreds of courtiers and nobles lined up at long wooden tables, all eyes drifting up toward the raised dais where the king sits beneath a tapestry stitched with lions or lilies. His food is not the same as everyone else's. Oh no. While lesser nobles nibble on trenchers of coarse bread and stew, the king's plate gleams with artistry, meat pies shaped like castles, fish moulded to resemble sea monsters, even edible flowers gilded in real gold leaf. The mainstay of any royal feast was meat. Pork, venison, beef, lamb. If it had legs, it probably ended up skewered and sizzling on the fire. The more exotic the animal, the better. In fact, serving something like a roast dolphin or a heron wasn't out of the question. These weren't choices of taste so much as theatre. There's a record of one particular king commissioning a pie so large it contained 23 different birds, each one stuffed inside the next in a feat of medieval taxidermy meets baking. Yes, the original turducken has royal roots, and the entertainment didn't stop with food. Between courses, guests might be treated to jugglers, troubadours, or, if the mood struck, a monkey dressed like a knight. One German emperor once had a mechanical automaton, a clockwork lion, that walked across the floor and opened its mouth to release a burst of rose petals. Why? Because he could. But this wasn't all gluttony and giggles. Every dish on that royal table had a deeper meaning. Roast swan symbolised nobility, eel stew represented penance. Even the humble pottage, that thick porridge-like mix of grains and vegetables, signalled a nod to tradition and peasantry. Kings often balanced opulence with symbolism, sending messages through every bite. Now let's take a moment to appreciate a true medieval menu. Picture yourself handed a parchment by a powdered footman. You scan it. First course, thick black bread, blood pudding, cold eel pie. Second course, roast beef glazed in honey and vinegar, a bake meat, that's an enclosed meat pie, and mulled hippocras, a spiced wine laced with cinnamon and ginger. Third course, wafers and comfits, small candied seeds like anise and fennel, and somewhere in the chaos, probably a moulded jelly shaped like a cathedral. But how did they eat all this without modern utensils? Well, they didn't. Forks were viewed with suspicion, sometimes even with religious disdain. The Byzantine princess Maria Argyropoulos shocked Venetians in the 11th century by using a two-pronged fork at dinner. People genuinely thought it was a sign of vanity, or worse, devilry. So kings dug in with their hands, sometimes wearing gloves, often using shared knives and large spoons. Napkins were a novelty. Sleeves did the trick. And then there's the matter of trenchers. Not plates, but stale slabs of bread that absorbed sauces and grease. Once too soggy to be useful, these were tossed to the dogs, or more nobly donated to the poor. A king's generosity could be judged by how many soggy trenchers he gave away. Behind all this splendour lurked an undercurrent of danger. Poisoning was a real fear. Food tasters weren't just ceremonial, they were necessary, and kitchens were tightly controlled. Recipes were often guarded like state secrets. There's a recorded case of an attempted assassination by almond milk poisoned with arsenic. Yes, Even medieval hipsters had enemies. Still, not every feast ended in disaster. Often, they were moments of genuine joy and communal bonding. During coronations or weddings, townsfolk might be invited to feast in the outer courts, where entire oxen were roasted on spits the size of wagons. Free beer flowed like rivers. If you were lucky enough to be born into a village near a royal castle, you might find yourself gnawing on a roasted goose leg while a minstrel sang songs about how brave and terribly misunderstood the current monarch was. Historians still argue whether these elaborate displays actually reflected what kings ate on a daily basis, or if they were rare performances for political and ceremonial reasons. Some say the everyday diet of a king wasn't too different from a noble's. A bit more meat, a few more exotic fruits, and of course, better tableware. Others believe kings indulged more often than records suggest, but left the daily gluttony undocumented out of modesty or strategic image control. One mainstream fact, though, is consistent across chronicles. Meat was prestige. The more meat, the higher your status. And kings? They had access to everything. From wild boar brought down by royal hunting parties to partridges imported in cages lined with velvet. Their kitchens held larders filled with aged cheeses, hanging sausages, pickled fish, and dried fruits that had travelled from Moorish Spain or beyond. For dessert, yes, they had those too. Royal sweet tables offered more than just pies. Sugar sculptures shaped like castles, candied ginger, almond milk blancmange, and wafers perfumed with rosewater often closed out the evening. These weren't merely tasty, they were proof of wealth, since sugar was pricier than gold per ounce in some places. As the feast wound down and goblets were drained, guests often lingered by the fire, trading gossip, nibbling leftover comfits, or dozing off on benches padded with old cloaks. And through it all, the king, stuffed, slightly flushed, and perhaps leaning too far back in his throne, sat with the subtle satisfaction of a man who knew he had eaten better than 99.9% of the population. Again. So, when you next see an image of a medieval banquet, long tables, dogs underfoot, platters stacked high, remember that it wasn't just about sustenance. For kings, food was power, pageantry, and propaganda, and they wielded it with as much flair as their jewelled sceptres. Deep beneath the glittering feast hall, down a damp stairwell behind a velvet-draped tapestry, the real magic simmers. Here, in the royal kitchens, everything is louder, hotter, and infinitely more chaotic. Fires roar not in dainty hearths, but in massive stone furnaces the size of carriages. Smoke curls from blackened chimneys, sizzling meat drips onto glowing coals, and the clang of copper pots rings out like church bells in a thunderstorm. Forget the king's delicate plate of roasted capon and saffron pudding. This is where it's born. And it's not a tidy affair. Royal kitchens in the Middle Ages weren't rooms, they were complexes. Often as sprawling as small villages, they were broken into parts: the bakehouse, the boiling house, the larder, the pastry room, the buttery, and the saucery. Not a typo, it's where sauces came to life. Each had its own staff, rules, and temperamental ovens. The master cook ran the operation like a battle-hardened general, barking orders through clouds of flour and fowl feathers, and beneath him, dozens, sometimes hundreds of assistants, each with one grimy, repetitive task. Take the humble spit boy, for instance. His job, to crouch beside a giant rotisserie spit and turn it, all day, with a hand crank or, if he was lucky, a dog-powered tread wheel, which, yes, was exactly what it sounds like, a canine-sized hamster wheel connected to a gear. This, dear listener, is the unsung culinary heroism behind your perfectly golden suckling pig. And then there's the sauce maker, the maestro of medieval flavour. He juggles cloves, mace, nutmeg and peppercorns like some medieval spice wizard. Remember, these spices weren't just for taste. They were bling. Imports from the east, travelling dangerous silk and spice routes, they cost a fortune. Cinnamon was practically currency. A dash of saffron in the sauce? That's like dripping Rolex on your roast. A lesser-known fringe tidbit, some medieval recipes called for ingredients that were entirely inedible. Why? Decoration. There are recipes for subtleties, elaborate edible sculptures made of sugar, almond paste and jelly, shaped into everything from battle scenes to entire castles. Sometimes they'd even conceal live birds inside hollow pastries that would burst out when the pie was cut, like a feathery magic trick. These weren't meals, they were edible theatre, the Las Vegas residencies of the royal culinary world. But let's not forget the tools. Medieval royal kitchens were stocked with a baffling array of gadgets: massive cleavers, skewers as long as fishing rods, cauldrons so heavy it took 2 men to lift them, and something called a dripping pan the size of a sleigh, used to collect meat juices for sauces. There were even rotating roast jacks, mechanical devices powered by heated air currents or counterweights to turn spits automatically. These kings may not have had microwaves, but they had some wild engineering. Daily operations were an ordeal. First, the market run, done not by kings, obviously, but by the purveyors who sourced ingredients from townsfolk or local estates. These purveyors had royal writ, which meant they could requisition almost anything from almost anyone. Imagine a nobleman's henhouse suddenly minus 30 hens, all because the king fancied omelettes. Not exactly polite. Then came the prep. Butchering, plucking, salting, soaking. This wasn't just food, it was logistics. A royal dinner might require 50 ducks, 20 geese, 12 oxen, barrels of mead, wheels of cheese, mountains of leeks, garlic by the bushel, and enough wine to drown a minstrel. All of it had to be cleaned, trimmed, marinated, and organised with medieval precision. It's no wonder that even medium-sized royal households often employed over 200 kitchen workers. But not all labour was culinary. The ewery managed water and wine, the spicery stored and measured those precious powders from abroad, and the scullery scrubbed endlessly. Pots, pans, knives, trenchers, and probably the occasional goose footprint from the floor. That greasy, smoky air hanging above the castle kitchens. That's the scent of someone's entire life spent washing spoons. Of course, not all kings were content to remain upstairs while this delicious chaos brewed below. Some, like Richard II of England, took a curious and even controlling interest in food preparation. Under his patronage, one of the oldest surviving English cookbooks was compiled. The form of curry meaning cooking, not curry, despite the modern confusion. It contains hundreds of recipes detailing how to make everything from rabbit stew to almond milk custards. It's filled with rare spices, complex techniques, and unapologetic extravagance. Curiously, that same cookbook also reveals how medieval cooks balanced taste with medicine. Food wasn't just fuel or art. It was thought to influence your body's humours. Everything, hot, cold, wet, dry, had to be in harmony. Too much hot and wet, you risked a fever. That's why lemon sauce might accompany a fatty meat, to balance the humours, not just the flavours. Historians still argue whether these pairings were truly believed to heal, or simply offered an excuse for culinary creativity. Food preservation was also crucial. Without refrigeration, meats were smoked, salted, or pickled. Fish, essential for all those meatless Fridays and holy days, was dried and barreled in brine. Fruits were turned into pastes, boiled into syrups, or sealed in honey. A medieval kitchen was part chemistry lab, part apothecary, and entirely unpredictable. Things spoiled, fast, and a kitchen disaster didn't just mean grumbling guests, it could be politically catastrophic. Imagine a foreign dignitary biting into spoiled pheasant. International incident, anyone? So how did they keep it all in check? Records. Endless, obsessive, beautifully neurotic records. Royal clerks logged every ounce of flour, every flask of wine, every spoonful of lard. Who ate what, when, and how much. It's all written down. Some of these records survive today, and they tell stories of both lavishness and penny pinching. One ledger notes the purchase of 12 hedgehogs for pie stuffing. Another lists 10,000 eggs for Whitsuntide, followed by a curiously vague entry. 4 tubs of mysterious paste. We may never know. Quirky anecdote break. One Hungarian king was so obsessed with his kitchen's efficiency that he had it staffed with eunuchs. Not because of their cooking skill, but because he believed they'd be less distracted and more hygienic. You can't make this stuff up. Well, you could, but medieval reality often beats fiction. Of course, not every kitchen worker was anonymous. The master cook often held noble status, especially in larger courts. He was paid handsomely, sometimes knighted, and trusted with state secrets. Why? Because he saw everything. Who dined with whom? Who skipped meals? Who left food untouched? In a world where politics and poison were only a fork apart, the kitchen was both sacred and suspicious. The scale of these operations is almost comedic. At one royal wedding feast in France, Records show 28 oxen, 300 sheep, 2,000 chickens, 100,000 eggs, and enough flour to bury a village were used, just for one weekend. And no, they didn't have leftovers boxed up for later. Even waste was regulated. Bones were used for broth. Fat was rendered for candles. Old bread became stuffing or was fed to the pigs. Leftovers went to the poor, or more often, to the almoner, a specific role tasked with distributing food to the needy in the monarch's name. It was charity, yes, but also good PR. But amidst the grandeur and grease, the royal kitchen was a place of danger. Fires were constant threats. Knives flew, cauldrons tipped. One contemporary account mentions a cook boiling a stag's head, slipping and falling directly into the pot. He survived, but his beard did not. Through all this, the rhythm of kitchen life never ceased. Morning to night, feast or famine, the fires stayed lit. Cooks aged quickly. Scullions grew calluses on their calluses. But there was pride in it too. To serve the king's table, even from the shadows, meant proximity to power. So next time you imagine a medieval king tearing into a haunch of meat, spare a thought for the kitchen far below, for the sweating spit boy, for the sauce maker with mace-stained sleeves, for the baker sculpting swans from dough while a cat sleeps on a flour sack. Their world was fiery, frantic, and always a little flour-dusted. But without them, the king's plate would be empty, and his image far less golden. Morning in a medieval castle arrives not with sunlight, but with the dull groan of chains pulling open wooden shutters, the caw of rooks circling chimney smoke, and somewhere in the stone corridors, the unmistakable sound of a chamberlain shuffling toward the king's chamber with a basin of warm rose water. But what he's not carrying, what he never carries, is breakfast. You see, in much of the medieval world, the idea of breakfast as we know it today is suspicious at best, sinful at worst. In many courts, eating before Mass was frowned upon, even considered gluttonous. The day was supposed to begin with prayer and fasting. Food came later, when your soul had been sufficiently humbled and your stomach was appropriately hollow. But royal rules, like most, were bendable. Some kings did eat in the morning, just discreetly, a little something known as a déjeuner, meaning to break the fast, which might include a slice of cold meat, a cup of warm ale, maybe a hunk of cheese or yesterday's bread reheated near the hearth. This was less a meal and more a strategic nibble, fuel for early meetings, long hunts, or the occasional siege planning. In royal households, the first proper meal of the day was usually called dinner, and it hit around 10 a.m. or 11, give or take the Mass, political tension, and whether the bishop had arrived yet. It was this mid-morning feast that functioned as the main event, stacked with the meats, pies, stews, and sauces we've already smelled trailing from the kitchen. But let's rewind slightly and focus on what happened in those quiet, flickering hours before the court stirred. The royal waking ritual was itself a kind of performance. The king or queen awoke in grand chambers heavy with embroidered drapery, fur-lined throws, and air so still you could hear the rats debate philosophy in the walls. Servants brought scented water for hand-washing, then helped with dressing, an ordeal involving layers of linen, wool, brocade, and if it was winter, enough padding to resemble an especially regal marshmallow. Once properly attired, the monarch might sit for a quick morning consultation. Letters, petitions, a bit of gossip slipped in with the day's religious texts, and during this time that discreet little not breakfast might appear. Always plain, always light. Porridge was acceptable. So was bread dipped in wine. Nothing extravagant, no omelettes, no jam, no buttery croissants. The idea was to eat without seeming to indulge. Of course, exceptions existed. One infamous example, King Louis XI of France, known for his paranoia and pungent habits, reportedly ate a hearty breakfast of boiled capons and garlic stew before sunrise. Historians still argue whether this was out of preference or paranoia. Some say he believed garlic would ward off poison. Others think he just really, really liked garlic. Meanwhile, in England, things were a bit more restrained, until Edward IV came along. The man adored meat. Chroniclers whisper that he started his mornings with flesh and wine, and not metaphorically. That said, such indulgence was viewed askance by more pious factions. Monastic records routinely condemned early eating, calling it a habit of the weak-willed and overprivileged. One monk even referred to breakfast as the devil's yawn, which is a pretty dramatic way to describe toast. Interestingly, medieval medical texts had their own ideas about breakfast. Some physicians of the day believed that eating early weakened the digestive system. The body, they argued, was still awakening and unable to process food properly. Eating too soon meant the vapours of undigested meat would rise to your brain, an actual theory, and cloud your judgment. Royal advisers took these claims seriously, warning kings against starting the day with heavy fare unless absolutely necessary, like before a joust or diplomatic meeting with someone really annoying. Then again, there were exceptions built right into the calendar. Religious fasting days, for example, often allowed for a morning meal, called a collation, especially if one was travelling or ill, and travelling could be broadly interpreted by particularly hungry monarchs. A king visiting his garden might, with the right spin, be journeying for the glory of God, and therefore entitled to a bowl of almonds and dried figs at sunrise. Still, for all the pushback against early meals, the idea of the king's morning cup persisted. Usually wine diluted with water or a mild ale, this drink was as much ritual as refreshment. Sometimes served with a bit of spiced bread or a sliver of cold meat, it was the king's quiet nod to indulgence before the pageantry began. And pageantry came fast. By the time the sun climbed high enough to reach the stained glass of the great hall, courtiers were assembling for what truly passed as the day's first grand meal. While not technically breakfast, this dinner was the first public feeding of the royal stomach, and it carried symbolic weight. It showed the court the king was strong, active, and full of, well, mutton, probably. The layout of these meals followed a predictable but opulent rhythm. First came the server of the napery, laying down the table linens and washing the king's hands in perfumed water. Then the server of the cup, the server of the bread, the carver, the ewer, and so on. Each role meticulously observed, each movement orchestrated like a dance. So what, you ask, might the king eat during this mid-morning dinner? Let's build a sample plate. Start with a slice of manchet. Fine white bread, soft and warm from the ovens. Add a portion of boiled beef, seasoned with vinegar and parsley. Next to it, a baked custard, spiced with mace and clove, sitting beside a spoonful of morat, a wine and mulberry sauce meant to balance the richness. For drink, spiced wine, maybe a light ale. All of this consumed with only a knife and your impeccably washed hands. Then came the waster, a sweet course. Think fruit conserves, honey-drenched wafers, and possibly a bite of something nutty. Hazelnut wafers, or candied almonds, if they were in season. Royal teeth were not great, but their sweet tooths absolutely were. An odd but charming footnote in the annals of royal meals. Some kings kept breakfast testers, men who would consume a replica of the royal morning's portion an hour beforehand to ensure it wasn't poisoned. If the tester lived and didn't vomit on the floor, breakfast was deemed safe. Imagine having that job in your resume. Professional guinea pig, Est 1438. But the most curious part of all this is how the absence of breakfast itself became a kind of royal performance. Not eating early signalled discipline, religiosity and self-control. So in a way, the less a king ate before noon, the more powerful he appeared. That is, unless you caught him nibbling ham in private, in which case you were probably bribed to forget. Modern comparisons are tricky, but think of a medieval king's eating schedule as the inverse of intermittent fasting. They skipped breakfast out of spiritual and cultural guilt, had a massive dinner at what we'd call brunch o'clock, then maybe a lighter supper as the day wound down. Snacks were rare, and if you were caught sneaking one, you better have a religious excuse ready. And yet, despite the morning austerity, food was always waiting. Inside chambers, on warming plates, behind carved oak doors, the king's appetite had an entire infrastructure of support. Because no matter the hour, the realm depended on his strength. And sometimes, strength required a spoonful of fig pudding and a sip of mulled wine before sunrise. By mid-morning, when sunlight filters through stained glass and paints red and gold across cold stone floors, the royal table transforms once again, this time into a shrine of spice. A king's appetite in the Middle Ages was never sated by local bread and meat alone. Oh no. To impress his guests and signal his supremacy, a monarch needed something more rare, more dazzling, more dangerous to acquire, exotic luxuries from across the world. Let's begin with the spices, because this is where the drama starts. Cinnamon from Ceylon, pepper from India, cloves from the Moluccas, ginger from China, each a tiny, fragrant ambassador of power. These weren't sprinkled, they were paraded. Every grain of imported peppercorn whispered, "I can afford something you've only heard about in sermons." To understand the value of these ingredients, consider that a pound of saffron could cost more than a horse. A small vial of nutmeg might require its weight in gold. Sugar? Even more precious, sometimes locked in iron boxes and doled out by the pinch. These weren't merely flavourings, they were flexes. Kings didn't just eat spices, they displayed them. A dish might arrive at the royal table in a silver bowl, its lid lifted with ceremonial pomp to reveal not meat, but a mountain of spiced rice laced with raisins and almonds. Or perhaps a pottage of pike, swimming in a broth-tinted yellow with imported turmeric. Even eggs might be dyed with saffron, bright gold yolks atop a bed of beet-dyed breadcrumbs. It wasn't just food, it was edible theatre, and the stage was global. And who brought these wonders? Merchants, adventurers, and the occasional lunatic. Spice traders navigated bandit-haunted roads, pirate-infested waters, and tax-happy toll gates to bring their goods to European ports. From there, caravans wound their way to royal cities, where kings and queens bought their treasures not just for meals, but for medicine, ritual, and even bribes. Let's not forget the sugar, known in the early Middle Ages not as a sweetener but as a spice, a luxury, even a curative. It was used sparingly, often melted down and formed into sculptures known as subtleties or subtleties, delicate little castles or animals that dazzled guests between courses. The more intricate the sculpture, the wealthier the patron. And kings? They wanted their swan-shaped sugar sculptures with sugar feathers and sugar lakes reflecting sugar moons. But beyond spice and sugar, kings chased another exotic indulgence: fruits. Not your backyard apples, but oranges from Iberia, pomegranates from the Levant, and figs so delicate they had to be packed in straw and delivered with the reverence of a holy relic. Bananas? Rare, but documented. Melons? Occasionally. The more absurd the fruit's origin story, the more likely it was to be paraded at court. There are records, fringe but fascinating, of royal feasts where dishes were themed around geography. One course might represent the Orient, featuring rice, gingered lamb, and candied citrus. Another might be the Isles, heavy on beef, ale-braised greens, and barley bread. Some historians still argue whether these culinary cartographies were real traditions or just creative embellishments by scribes trying to impress their patrons. And then there were the drinks. While the lower classes swigged thin ale or goat milk, royal tables gleamed with goblets of imported wine. Malmsey from Greece, Rhine wine from Germany, or the deeply revered claret from Gascony, steeped in spices and sweetened with, you guessed it, sugar. Some kings preferred hippocras, a sweetened spiced wine filtered through cloth and served slightly warm, believed to cleanse the stomach after a heavy meal. It was a medieval digestif centuries before after-dinner mints, but not all drinks were equal. Some were statements. A cup of chilled rosewater from Moorish Spain sent a political message. We have trade routes, even the shape of a goblet mattered. Venetian glass, expensive, cut crystal, a fortune, a jewelled drinking horn carved from ivory. Well, now you're just showing off. The obsession with imported luxuries went beyond food and drink. Kings had entire storerooms devoted to exotica. Dried rose petals from Damascus, ambergris from Wales, yes, for flavouring, even musk scraped from the glands of deer. One royal inventory listed a pound of unicorn horn, which was probably narwhal tusk, but who's checking? These strange ingredients weren't only for the palate. Many doubled as medicine: sugar-eased coughs, clove-numbed toothaches, ginger-calmed nausea. A particularly weird tidbit: some recipes called for ground emerald or powdered pearl, believed to extend life and increase virility. We don't recommend it. In a sense, the royal appetite was as much alchemy as gastronomy. Kings experimented. They hosted feasts themed around transformation, serving meat disguised as fruit or fruit shaped like fish, all to entertain and astound. One banquet in France reportedly featured pies that, when cut, released live birds and frogs onto the table. The goal? Spectacle. Always spectacle. But beneath the gold leaf and saffron gloss, there were darker undertones. These imported luxuries came at immense cost, not just in gold, but in lives. The spice trade fueled wars, enslavement, and colonial ambitions. Entire naval expeditions were launched simply to secure cinnamon. Explorers like Vasco da Gama and Columbus weren't just chasing glory, they were chasing ginger. Still, in the moment, at the table, surrounded by flickering candlelight and embroidered tapestries, none of that mattered to the king. His court saw only the spectacle. A pomegranate split open like a jewel, wine that tasted like honeyed roses, a dish so laced with pepper it made courtiers cough in polite agony. Let's build one such royal menu. A fantasy, yes, but rooted in documented extravagance. Course 1. Pomegranate wine chilled with snow, served with saffron honey pears and sugared almonds. Course 2. Rice boiled in almond milk, topped with cinnamon lamb and sweet raisins from Cyprus. Course 3. Peacock baked in its own feathers, gilded with gold leaf and seasoned with cloves and ginger. Course 4. A subtlety, a sugar sculpture shaped like a knight slaying a dragon, both entirely edible, served with candied violets and musk-scented wafers. And for the finale, a toast with Malmsey wine perfumed with rosewater, in goblets so thin they shivered when lifted. Did it all taste good? Honestly, probably not always. The balance of flavours was very different from modern palates. Sweet and savoury often mingled, meat with sugar, fish with fruit, bread soaked in wine. Medieval palates were used to stronger flavours, less salt, more sourness. Vinegar was a key seasoning, but flavour was almost secondary to meaning. A meal was a message. Every bite said, I have what you don't. So the next time you toss cinnamon on your coffee or drizzle honey on toast, remember that these humble flavours once cost empires. They fueled crusades, inspired shipbuilding, and kept royal cooks awake at night, wondering whether one more clove might be too much. For kings of the Middle Ages, the meal was never just about hunger. It was a stage, a sermon, and sometimes a subtle war. And in every imported fig and spiced pie, the echoes of trade winds, distant ports, and whispered secrets passed through the lips of a man in velvet, crowned and always hungry for more. By the time the golden light of late afternoon slants across the chapel windows, the king's day has already been defined by what he hasn't eaten. Welcome to the labyrinthine world of medieval food laws, rules not set by hunger, but by heaven. In a royal court, the calendar was sacred, and meals were moulded by saints, fasts, and a long tangled web of ecclesiastical expectations. That roast venison you're craving. Better check if it's a Friday. If it is, you might be looking at a bowl of boiled peas instead. Religious fasting in the Middle Ages wasn't a Lenten side quest. It was the drumbeat of the year. Kings were expected to uphold the spiritual model of restraint. That meant no meat on Fridays, no animal products during Lent, Ember Days, Advent, Rogation Days, and over 130 other holy observances scattered like speed bumps across the months. In theory, a royal year was more fasting than feasting. But here's the twist. Royal fasting didn't mean starvation, it just meant creativity. Meat was banned, but fish? Fish was a loophole big enough to sail a gilded barge through, and so, enter the era of the fish feast, a full table decked with eel pies, almond milk fish stews, sturgeon in vinegar, and stuffed pike with raisins and ginger. Some royal cooks even carved fish into shapes that resembled roast fowl, because what's fasting without a little theological cosplay? Then there were the white meats. No, not chicken. We're talking dairy substitutes made from almonds, almond butter, almond milk cheese, even almond custards. Coconuts, when available, served as stand-ins for cream, their pulp grated into delicate snow and mixed with honey. These dishes were technically compliant, lavishly presented, and still decadent enough to maintain royal dignity. A king must not be seen gnawing a turnip like a peasant, even on a fast day. But when it wasn't a fast day, when the calendar gave its quiet permission, the royal feast was back on in full force, and nothing embodied this better than the grand, orchestrated medieval feast days. Coronations, saints' days, marriages, treaties. Any cause for celebration was also an excuse to throw a kitchen-scorching banquet. Some lasted hours, others lasted days. One infamous feast in England was said to span an entire week, requiring daily deliveries of oxen, lambs, ducks, barrels of claret, and 36 musicians who played so long their fingers bled. Of course, this rhythm between fasting and feasting was political too. A king's ability to host, and host correctly, was a show of both piety and power. He had to appear holy enough to honour the church's demands, but generous enough to satisfy the ever-hungry mouths of his nobles. Balancing the two wasn't easy. Too much fasting made you look miserly. Too much feasting risked the wrath of the bishops. It was a tightrope of roast herons and moral restraint. And that balance showed in the feast etiquette itself. Before any feast could begin, a series of rituals took place, many of them tied to religious purity. Hands were washed in rosewater. Prayers were offered. The royal cupbearer performed a little ceremonial pour, not just to show off the wine's clarity, but to prove the king wasn't about to be poisoned. Even the menu might be read aloud, partly to excite guests, partly to impress them with the sheer volume and variety of dishes. Here's a typical feast schedule in a well-run royal court. Day 1, arrival feast, welcoming visiting dignitaries with light dishes, poetry, and a few subtleties. Day 2, full banquet, dozens of courses, served in waves with entertainment between each. Day 3, the penance meal, more restrained, featuring fasting-approved dishes like fried sole in almond milk or pickled trout. Day 4, departure feast, a hearty final meal, rich in meat and wine, to send guests off in good humour and with belted waistbands. And each of these meals had their own laws. The meat couldn't be shared across rank lines. Nobles received venison, lesser guests got beef. Monks and churchmen, often seated far from the secular noise, were served fish regardless of the day. Children and women at court might be given blander dishes, partly due to age, partly due to outdated medical beliefs about delicate humours. One particularly quirky law, the peacock clause. In some regions, royal hosts were forbidden from serving a peacock unless it had been plucked, roasted, then redressed in its own feathers for dramatic presentation. To serve it plain was considered a waste of beauty and an insult to courtly flair. Of course, laws were bent. Documents show that special papal dispensations were frequently sought, allowing kings to eat meat on fast days for strength, especially during travel or illness. One archbishop granted a dispensation for 1 pheasant per fasting Tuesday, provided it be consumed alone and in prayerful silence. Loophole or loop punch, you decide. It wasn't just the church keeping an eye on the menu, secular law had its say too. Certain game meats could only be hunted and eaten by royalty. Poaching a royal deer wasn't just theft, it was treason. Even within the court, only select individuals could serve or carve specific dishes. The carver of the kipponeh might be a titled role. It wasn't just meat, it was hierarchy on a platter. And just to make things more fun, feast days often coincided with seasonal scarcity. Lent usually hit in late winter, when food stores were low and hunting was poor. The challenge? Hosting a lavish meal that obeyed the rules and masked the slim pickings. Hence the rise of pickled herring, dried cod, and potted eels. These preserved fish became the backbone of the Lenten table, especially when paired with fermented vegetables and strong wine to distract from the salt. Still, even on fast days the royal table gleamed. The silver was polished, the tapestries were hung, the candles flickered beside plates of vinegar-stewed beets and bread baked with herbs. It might not be meat, but it was still a message. Even in denial, I reign. This intertwining of fasting and feasting also extended to symbolic acts. During certain holy feasts the king would eat last, or not at all, as a sign of humility. At other times he'd host the poor, offering his own food to beggars outside the castle gates. Of course his own food was often curated leftovers, but the gesture was political gold. Public charity became public theatre. Historians still argue whether royal piety during feasting seasons was genuine or performative. Did kings truly believe that skipping goose on Fridays brought them closer to heaven? Or did they simply enjoy the elaborate loopholes and theatrical substitutions? The answer, as always, probably lies somewhere in between the almond milk and the fish pie. But what's clear is that food wasn't just sustenance, it was spiritual currency. To eat rightly was to rule rightly. To host in accordance with divine law was to mirror the heavenly banquet promised in Scripture. And when you're king, mirroring heaven is kind of the job description. Let's not forget the soundtrack to these feast fasts. Hymns in Latin echoed from side chapels. Psalms were chanted as courses were served. Even during meatless meals, the feast was a holy affair, one where heaven and hunger danced delicately around a dish of lentils soaked in cloves and vinegar. So, the next time you find yourself debating what to eat on a Friday, Remember that for medieval kings, every bite was a choice with consequences, not just for their health, but for their souls, their image, and occasionally their international alliances. In the end, whether it was a 100-dish coronation feast or a quiet Friday of almond custard and pickled perch, the medieval royal meal was a balancing act, an elaborate interplay between divine instruction, social expectation, and good old-fashioned indulgence. And through it all, the king sat beneath his canopy of estate, fingers stained with saffron, eyes half-lidded with contentment, knowing full well that tomorrow's menu might be dictated not by appetite, but by angels. When a king calls for a feast, it isn't always about hunger. Sometimes it's a flex, a statement, a kind of edible chessboard where every roasted swan and spiced pie plays a political role. Because in the Middle Ages, the royal dining table wasn't just a place for eating, it was a battleground. Welcome to this subtle, saucy art of political dining, where alliances are courted between mouthfuls and rivals are tested over wine. Picture it. A stone hall echoing with lute music, candles flickering in their iron sconces, tapestries rustling gently as the court gathers for dinner. Nobles file in, each taking their place not randomly but with calculated precision. The closer your bench is to the king's elevated table, the high table, the closer you are to his favour. Seating arrangements alone could spark gossip for weeks. Did Lord Warwick get moved closer to the salt? Was Lady Adela's seat downgraded to the third table near the hearth? Scandalous! This social stratification wasn't subtle. The king sat centre stage, quite literally on a dais raised above the floor with an embroidered canopy overhead. Beside him, his most favoured guests, likely foreign dignitaries, powerful barons, or ecclesiastical allies. Everyone else filtered outward, their rank decreasing with every table further from the throne. Even the food followed this hierarchy. A partridge served at the king's table might become goose for the mid-ranking nobles, and by the time it reached the lower hall it was stewed beef and brown bread if you were lucky. Feasting was a diplomatic tool. A good meal could soothe a frayed alliance. A badly executed one could ruin a truce. If you invited your enemy to dine and served him fish on a meat day, that might be seen as insult, or worse, a public humiliation. One king in Burgundy famously sent a rival a pie filled with live snakes as a gift. It was not received warmly. Royal banquets often coincided with treaty negotiations, marriages, or knightings, and each dish bore a message. A roast boar, for instance, was a symbol of strength. A subtlety depicting a lion devouring a lamb could serve as a not-so-veiled metaphor for conquest or submission. Even the sequence of dishes mattered. Meat before fish might imply aggression, while a sweet course served too early could suggest weakness. Yes, this was a world where the arrival of a fruit tart could cause tension. There's a delightful fringe example of this. At a 14th century feast in Paris, a guest was offered a delicate jelly moulded into the shape of a tower, topped with a sugar knight holding a pennant bearing the French royal arms. It was beautiful, and everyone clapped politely. But when a second, nearly identical jelly arrived for the English guest, this one with the English coat of arms floating atop, an argument broke out over which was taller. The jellies were measured. The French one was larger by half an inch. The English ambassador stormed out. Jelly diplomacy had failed. Even the order of service reflected politics. Food was served not by random kitchen boys, but by squires and young nobles looking to impress. To serve the king was an honour. To be assigned to serve a visiting lord signalled trust, or obligation. A dish arriving late, cold, or messily plated might suggest subtle sabotage or disapproval. In extreme cases, such accidents were no accident at all. Wine service, too, was charged with meaning. Pouring a full cup was a gesture of generosity. Pouring less than your guest's status demanded. A power play, refusing to drink wine offered by a host. That bordered on diplomatic insult. At one infamous banquet, a foreign prince refused his wine, claiming it smelled of Saxon sweat. He was asked to leave immediately, and yes, a short war followed not long after. Kings themselves could be master manipulators of the feast. They used their own plates to send messages. Sharing a dish with a guest signified deep favour. Offering a bite from one's own hand was practically a declaration of brotherhood. Ignoring a guest's dish entirely, that was a snub everyone noticed. People took notes, literally. Chroniclers often detailed who got what and what that meant. Even music played its part. Trumpets blared for important arrivals. Harpists played during sensitive conversations. Minstrels sang tales of heroic loyalty or cautionary betrayal, carefully selected to echo the dynamics of the room. One bold bard once sang a ballad about a treacherous duke during a feast, where said duke was in attendance. The room fell silent. The king laughed. The duke did not. These feasts were theatrical, yes, but also precarious. For every grand banquet that sealed an alliance, another quietly unravelled one. Food poisoning, whether accidental or deliberate, was a feared consequence. This is why kings often had tasters, men assigned to eat a portion of each dish before it reached the royal mouth. Imagine the tension at the high table if the taster paused, squinted at a fig tart and pushed it away. Conversation stopped. Jaws froze mid-bite. Even a sneeze from the royal end of the table could make lesser nobles start nervously counting their blessings and their enemies. But food could also heal political wounds. Shared bread in many cultures symbolised peace. Breaking a trencher together might be the first step in ending a feud. One king famously ended a year-long border war by inviting his rival to a feast and offering him the liver from the same roasted ox carved by the king himself, a deeply symbolic act of conciliation. It worked. The war ended over that meal. These gestures had religious undertones too. The Eucharist, the ritual sharing of bread and wine, hovered over every royal meal, casting sacred significance onto each course. A feast wasn't just political theatre, it was a quasi-religious performance. To dine with the king was, in some ways, to take communion with power. One open debate among historians centres on whether these political feasts actually reflected the king's true sentiments, or if they were elaborate acts designed to mislead. Did sharing a trench with an enemy mean forgiveness? Or was it a trap, a test, a final performance before exile? Accounts differ. Some see these meals as moments of genuine diplomacy, others as clever stagecraft, sharp knives behind the silver goblets. Let's imagine a political feast in action. The hall is full, humming with anticipation. A northern duke, recently accused of plotting rebellion, has been summoned. Instead of jail, he's offered a seat 2 places down from the king. The message: watch yourself. The first course arrives, a roast capon carved in the shape of a phoenix, rebirth, hope. The second course, a stew of leeks and onions, traditional but humble, served in equal portions to all. The third course, a fish moulded into the crest of the king's house, eyes made of sugared almonds. When the king raises his goblet and toasts the duke, in friendship and fire, everyone smiles, but no one relaxes. Because in the Middle Ages, you never quite knew what was in the pudding. Interestingly, even not hosting a feast could be political. Failing to provide hospitality to a visiting noble was a clear affront. In 13th century Aragon, one baron reported to court that the king's kitchen offered him only boiled cabbage during his visit. That cabbage became the subject of months of letters, apologies, and ultimately a failed marriage alliance. Cabbage diplomacy. It's real. And so, the royal table became not just a place of pleasure, but a forum of statecraft. Every dish, every seat, every goblet of wine was a piece in a puzzle, a move on the board, a whisper in a grander conversation. Beneath the steaming platters and glazed hams lay plots, promises, and the occasional poison. When the last plate was cleared and the final toast made, the real game often began. Quiet walks in castle gardens, whispered meetings in alcoves, secret notes passed in folded napkins. But it all started at the table, under candlelight, with a spoonful of something rich and suspicious. So next time you pass hors d'oeuvres at a modern party, just remember, your ancestors were negotiating territory, titles, and treason over slices of eel pie. And the king? He was watching who finished their pheasant. Far from the glory of the high table and the glitter of jewelled goblets lies a kingdom few ever see, the back-breaking, heat-choked, smoke-stained realm of the royal kitchen staff. It's here, beneath a vaulted stone ceiling slick with soot and hung with hams and herbs, that an invisible army labours in unison, making royal meals possible. Tonight, we descend into that noisy underworld to meet the real magicians behind the feast, the sauce makers, pastry men, spit turners, and sculptors of jelly. The first thing you notice is the noise, not the refined clinking of silverware, but the roaring of fires, the slosh of boiling vats, and the hiss of fat hitting flame. Cooks bark orders in 3 languages, dogs bark louder beneath the tables, and a boy runs by with a sack of eels slapping against his thighs. This is not a place for the weak of nose or stomach. It smells like a mix of onion, iron, old wine and ambition. Royal kitchens were like cities, each with its own districts and specialists. The sorcery was perhaps the most elite. It sounds like a joke, but this room held real prestige. To be a sauce maker was to be a kind of culinary chemist. These were men who understood the delicate balance between acid and fat, between pepper and honey. They didn't just make sauce, they made statements. A sauce could mask a tough cut of meat, revive a 3-day-old fish, or impress a visiting ambassador with a single spoonful. And their ingredient list read like a merchant's wish list. Verjuice from unripe grapes, vinegar from 5 different regions, herbs grown in the royal greenhouse, and spices so precious they were kept under lock and key. Recipes for sauces were often memorised, never written down. This wasn't just protection of trade secrets, it was survival. Mess up a sauce, and you might offend the king. Offend the king, and suddenly you're stirring porridge for monks in a cold abbey far from court. Next door was the pastry room, a place of flowery chaos and genius. Here, men and women shaped dough not only into pies but into art. Castles, ships, hunting scenes, even mythical beasts. These weren't desserts. These were main courses sealed in hard pastry shells, or coffins, designed to preserve the meat within. The crust was often inedible, baked rock hard, but that didn't matter. It was all about presentation. There's a marvellous fringe record of a royal pie shaped like a cathedral, complete with turrets and tiny stained glass windows made from dyed sugar panes. Inside was a goose stuffed with a pheasant, stuffed with a quail, stuffed with minced pork. Did it taste good? Hard to say. Did it make jaws drop and visiting lords feel both hungry and deeply inadequate? Absolutely. Meanwhile, in the scullery, life was less glamorous. This was where the dirtiest work happened. Scullions scrubbed pots so large they had to be climbed into. They scraped plates, descaled fish, and wrestled with buckets of slop destined for the piggery. Their reward? A hard crust of bread, a splash of thin ale, and the possibility of maybe, just maybe, being noticed by a master cook and promoted to the larder or buttery. The larder managed cold storage, a crucial job when refrigeration meant deep stone rooms, salt, and a prayer. The buttery oversaw drink distribution, from mead to wine to the ever-important small beer, low-alcohol ale for daily hydration. The man in charge here had to be both careful and cunning. A king didn't like being shorted on his favourite Gascon vintage. Wine theft was a hanging offence, but so was inebriating the wrong guest. Then there was the spicery, where the air was heady with cloves, nutmeg, ginger and saffron. This room was sacred. Only trusted clerks could enter, and every pinch was recorded in ink. Because when a pound of cinnamon could fund a village, a generous sprinkle could bankrupt a kitchen. Yet perhaps the most enchanting corner of the royal kitchen was the realm of the subtleties. These were the jelly sculptors, the sugar blowers, the artists who turned food into spectacle. Their work arrived between courses designed to awe, a sugar dragon breathing almond-scented smoke, a jelly garden with candied flower petals and a marzipan unicorn. Subtleties were edible allegories, messages in sugar like sweetened sermons. Their creation involved delicate, dangerous work. Sugar had to be boiled at precise temperatures without modern thermometers, moulded, dyed, shaped. The jelly had to be strained through linen bags and poured into moulds, sometimes cooled in snow. Some artists used fine wires to animate their creations, sugar birds whose wings flapped when guests clapped. These weren't just desserts. They were propaganda, poetry, and party tricks all in one. And let's not overlook the kitchen boys, young lads who began at the bottom, turning spits, fetching water, chasing rats, and occasionally being used as stand-ins for temperature checks. If the kitchen was too hot for the boy, it was probably just right for the roast. They learned by watching, by suffering burns, and by stealing bites when no one was looking. With luck, they might rise through the ranks, eventually reaching the role of assistant cook, or even master cook, though the path was paved with blisters, calluses, and countless onions. Now consider the logistics. Feeding a king and his court wasn't a one-meal operation. The kitchen ran almost continuously, churning out meals for guards, clerks, pages, visiting nobles, and of course, the royal family. On an average day, the kitchen might prepare 300 meals. On feast days, thousands. One record notes that for a single banquet, the royal kitchen boiled 1,200 eggs, roasted 80 deer, and baked 250 pies. All of this had to be coordinated without modern communication. No phones, no walkie-talkies, just bells, shouted orders, and an elaborate chain of command. The master cook didn't just know recipes, he managed schedules, inventories, personalities, and egos. He was part chef, part general, part therapist. Yet despite the labour, the burns, the pressure, the staff often found pride in their work. To cook for the king was to be close to power. To have one's sauce praised by a duke or one's pie admired by a foreign ambassador could mean a raise, a new title, or even land. Yes, land, for baking a really good pie. Medieval priorities were deliciously strange. Historians still debate how much autonomy these cooks had. Some argue that recipes came down directly from the court physicians and stewards, leaving little room for innovation. Others believe that the creativity we see in medieval cookbooks, the sugar subtleties, the gilded birds, the surprise pies, reflects real artistic freedom, encouraged by kings who loved novelty. What's certain is that mistakes were not easily forgiven. A burnt dish, a spoiled stew, or an undercooked roast wasn't just a culinary failure, it was a political risk. A guest served cold meat might question the king's hospitality. A wrongly seasoned sauce could be misinterpreted as an insult. There's a documented case where a cook was flogged for serving an underspiced pigeon to a visiting bishop. Harsh, perhaps, but in the high-stakes world of royal cuisine, everything was symbolic. So tonight, as you drift into dreams of golden halls and roasted boars, spare a thought for the invisible hands who made it all happen, for the flour-dusted boy turning the spit, for the sauce maker testing the balance of vinegar and honey, for the jelly sculptor coaxing a sugar swan into flight. Because behind every royal meal is a battalion of cooks, carvers, servers and scrapers, anonymous, exhausted and brilliant. They didn't wear crowns, but without them the crown wouldn't shine quite so bright. The torches along the stone walls sputter as dusk creeps in, casting long shadows over the castle corridors. A page hurries past with a folded scroll. A steward whispers hurried instructions to a cook, and in the great hall the fires are stoked, the silver polished, the goblets are lined. Tonight is no ordinary supper. Tonight we dine like a Plantagenet, one of the grand monarchs of medieval England, rulers known as much for their tempers and politics as for their ravenous appetites. Let's settle in beside Edward I, nicknamed Longshanks, a king who towered over his peers both physically and politically. A man of war and ambition, Edward wasn't the type to nibble daintily at a salad. No, his table groaned beneath the weight of meats, cheeses and enough bread to pave the road to Wales. Yet for all his martial bluster, Edward's meals followed strict order, and his court was obsessed with decorum. This evening the table is set for a formal royal dinner, not a feast, but a high-level courtly meal, attended by nobles, clergy, and the ever-present retinue of scribes and squires. The food is not just nourishment, it's protocol, performance, and sometimes political message. And so the courses begin. First, the arrival of the ewer, bearing a silver basin and towel. The king holds out his hands, and they're washed in warm rose water, a ritual that signifies cleanliness but also hierarchy. Only he and his honoured guests receive this treatment. Everyone else will wash at a communal basin in the courtyard, if at all. Then comes the bread, manchet, the finest white loaf, served with a knife carved from ivory and a pinch of salt placed ceremoniously on the plate. Salt, rare and taxed, is another symbol of status. You're either above the salt or below it. Edward, obviously, is at the top. The first course arrives on gilded platters, roasted capons stuffed with sage and dates, flanked by pies of eel and carp, their crusts elaborately moulded with vines and heraldic crests. A side of lampreys in wine sauce steams beside a tower of buttered leeks and creamed carrots. A delicate pottage, oats, cream, and ground almonds, makes its quiet appearance, thick and fragrant. It's a subtle nod to the Lenten calendar, though tonight is no fast. There's a pause, filled with soft harp music. Edward is not given to idle chatter while dining, though his gaze is sharp. He notes who eats what, who declines what, and who lingers too long over the wine. Every motion is recorded silently by the watching scribes. Historians still argue whether Edward used these meals as intelligence-gathering sessions, but the evidence is compelling. The second course brings heavier fare: venison with rosemary and cloves, a dish long associated with royal privilege, since only kings and licensed nobles were allowed to hunt it. Alongside it, a pie filled with pork, apples, and black pepper, simple in concept, but elevated with a rich glaze of saffron and egg yolk. There's also a porpoise roast, dark and oily, served with mustard, a true delicacy for a king with the means to have such coastal wonders carted inland. As Edward carves a piece of venison with a ceremonial knife, long, curved, and inlaid with jet, he nods toward the guest to his right, a visiting noble from Gascony, now nervously watching as a silver dish of preserved quince is presented. The fruit, imported and rare, is a diplomatic touch. Gascony, after all, supplies much of England's wine. Offering something sweet from the south is a subtle, edible compliment. Let's not forget the drink. The royal cupbearer serves a claret seasoned with ginger, cinnamon and sugar, a mix known as hippocras. It's warmed slightly, filtered through linen and presented in a goblet rimmed with silver. It glows red in the candlelight, and Edward raises it without toasting. He's not one for performative cheer. Instead, he sips quietly, eyes scanning the hall. The walls are alive with quiet activity. Carvers prepare the next dish. Dogs lie beneath the tables waiting for scraps, and boys refill trenchers, the flat rounds of stale bread that act as edible plates. Though Edward won't eat from trenchers, his food comes on pewter or silver, many of his guests will, and those soggy bread rounds will later be collected and redistributed to the poor, or so the records claim. Dessert approaches, not a chocolate cake, the new world hasn't happened yet, but a suite of medieval sweets, candied ginger, almond tarts, baked pears in honey, and a subtlety, a sugar sculpture shaped like a lion devouring a boar. The symbolism, Edward's conquest of Wales, if you read it that way. Or perhaps it's just sugar showing off. One scholar notes that Edward, despite his martial reputation, had a surprisingly delicate palate. He favoured sauces with sharpness, mustards, vinegars, wine reductions, and avoided overly sweet dishes, which he considered childish. He also had a fondness for shellfish, particularly oysters, which were hauled from coastal estuaries in barrels of seawater and rushed inland to preserve their freshness. His physicians, ever worried about the royal humours, recommended moderation. According to surviving household records, Edward's diet was carefully monitored for balance. Hot and dry foods, like roast beef, were offset with cool and moist items, like stewed lettuce or fruit pastes. Whether he followed these guidelines religiously is debatable, but the notes are there, scrawled in neat clerical Latin in the margins of the kitchen accounts. There's one unusual tidbit. Edward is said to have disliked garlic, deeply. Servants were forbidden from preparing dishes with heavy garlic on court days. One poor cook, according to legend, was reassigned to latrine maintenance after slipping garlic into a trout pie meant for the king. A harsh punishment for a fragrant mistake. By now the meal is winding down, the fire is low. The guest reclines slightly, belts discreetly loosened. Edward sits back, fingers steepled, his eyes heavy-lidded but alert. One final cup of hippocras is served, this time with wafers, thin, crisp biscuits flavoured with rosewater and fennel seed. These signal the end of the meal, the closing chord, and then, as if on cue, a boy enters carrying a silver basin. The hand-washing ritual repeats. The king dabs his fingers, not a crumb visible on them, and nods once. The table is cleared in silence, each dish swept away like a scene change in a play. Outside, the night hums with the sound of crickets and the distant clatter of horse hooves on stone. Inside, the king rises and steps into the shadows of the hallway, leaving behind the warmth and scent of his evening meal, a blend of roast, sweet, and strategy. What did Edward I really think of his dinner? We'll never know. But the records he left behind, the household rolls, the kitchen logs, the spice tallies, paint a portrait of a man who understood the power of food, not only as sustenance, but as spectacle, statement, and silent command. Dine like a Plantagenet, and you're not just eating, you're declaring dominance with every bite. The flicker of torchlight dances over cold stone as muffled footsteps echo through the castle's silent corridors. But tonight's banquet hall isn't filled with laughter, or the clinking of goblets. There is no music, no subtlety paraded between courses, no roast peacock in feathered glory. The banners hang heavy, the tapestries dull in the low light. Tonight, the king is dead, and so begins a different kind of feast, the funerary meal. A royal arval, named for the Old Norse custom of the arval, or inheritance feast, this gathering is sombre, symbolic, and steeped in ceremony. It marks not just the end of a life, but the transition of power, the acknowledgement of grief, and the reaffirmation of order. Here, even mourning has a menu. As with coronations and weddings, the death of a king demanded a response from the royal kitchens. But instead of preparing dishes meant to dazzle or delight, cooks now worked with a different palate: blackened sauces, bitter herbs, and cold meats. The food, like the mood, was subdued, ritualized, and freighted with meaning. Let's imagine the setting. In a side hall draped with black and purple cloth, long tables are set not with silver but with pewter. There is no music, only the faint rustle of silk mourning garments and the occasional sniffle. Pages move silently between guests distributing bread, cheese, and wine. The food is meagre by royal standards, but not humble. A roast boar is carved not for indulgence, but as a gesture of continuity. The meat, always shared from the central platter, symbolises unity among the court. A dish of pottage, thick, grey and unsalted, is served as the first course. It is intentionally bland. Salt, that ancient symbol of preservation, is absent by design. The king's body has been preserved by other means, and the court, for now, eats without joy. Then comes the fish, cold trout with bitter greens. Fish, associated with fasting and reflection, dominates these tables. No meat from animals that walk the earth is served until after the funeral. The fish may be seasoned with vinegar or verjuice, but spices are minimal. Saffron, cinnamon, and ginger are notably missing. In medieval belief, such flavours were seen as stimulating, even sinful, and this was no time for pleasure. Dessert, if it appears, is a dark fruit paste, plums or blackberries, spread on unleavened bread. Wine is poured in modest cups, unspiced, unfortified, and taken in silence. This is not Hippocrates. This is a cup raised to mortality. One particularly eerie tradition. During these feasts, a loaf of bread or a slab of meat might be left untouched at the head of the table, symbolically reserved for the deceased. In some regions, a cup of wine was poured and set before an empty chair. In others, a candle was placed in the plate's centre, burning as the meal progressed. But while the first funerary meal was quiet and reflective, the second was something else entirely. After the burial, often days or weeks later, the true funeral feast began. This was the moment of inheritance, of declarations, and of carefully crafted reassurance. The realm had lost a king, yes, but not a kingdom, and the table now had to prove it. The second funerary banquet was grand, lavish even, designed to remind everyone that the line of succession was intact, the treasury was full, and the cooks, still very much employed. Gone were the bitter greens. In came roasted fowl, swans were feathered and mounted in regal poses, venison with wine sauce, and entire oxen turned on great spits. It was not a celebration of the king's death, but of the realm's continuity. The message was clear: the crown has passed, and the court, despite its grief, endures. One historical example comes from the death of Henry III in 1272. At his memorial feast, records mention over 200 barrels of wine, 40 deer, and enough bread to feed more than 1,500 attendees. The high table served gilded meat pies, sweet almond puddings, and hippocras by the gallon. The subtleties for the occasion depicted biblical scenes of kings dying in battle, ascending to heaven, or handing swords to their heirs. It was theatre in sugar and flour, staged for political comfort. Interestingly, the transition from mournful meal to magnificent feast often followed a carefully choreographed ritual. After the funeral mass, guests would assemble for a symbolic first bite, usually bread and wine, shared in silence. Then the steward of the household would enter and declare the beginning of the second course. Music would resume. The scent of roasting meats would fill the hall. A minstrel might sing of the dead king's valour. A bishop might bless the new monarch. Plates were refilled, and the mood, slowly, deliberately, was lifted. One fringe tidbit. In some courts, the very menu of the funeral feast was designed as a riddle. Each dish, each course, each garnish was meant to evoke an aspect of the dead king's reign. A fish dish laced with bitter herbs might represent early conflict. A lamb dish drizzled with honey might reflect a period of peace. A pie shaped like a crown, cut in half, signified the end of the rule, but not the end of legacy. Even the serving staff played a role. During the first mournful meal, they wore black. During the second, they changed to colours associated with the new monarch's livery. It was a visual cue that the realm had turned its page. A small, edible detail. In some French courts, the first dessert served after mourning was a tart shaped like a rose, symbolising rebirth. Historians still argue whether these symbolic meals were always so carefully constructed, or whether later chroniclers imposed meaning onto what may have been more practical arrangements. But surviving menus, descriptions and visual records suggest that much thought did indeed go into the emotional arc of royal, funerary dining. It's worth noting that for all their theatricality, these feasts served a psychological function. Death was not hidden in the medieval world. It sat beside you, danced on the margins, and occasionally joined you at dinner. A dead king meant instability, and instability could mean war. The banquet was as much therapy as it was tradition. Let's imagine the culmination of a royal funeral feast. The new king, young, perhaps nervous, sits where his father once sat. He's flanked by advisors, bishops, a few wary nobles. The meat is carved with precision. The sauces are flawless. The wine is poured generously. But no one quite relaxes until the subtlety arrives. It's shaped like a tree, half in bloom, half bare. On the green side, birds, fruit, a crown perched among the leaves. On the withered side, a sword plunged into the bark. The message is clear. Life goes on. Rule continues. The court breathes out. The meal ends with a toast, not to the dead, but to the realm. It is solemn. It is calculated. It is effective. So while the coronation may be the moment of official transition, the funerary feasts are the quiet linchpins of royal continuity. In their bitter herbs and golden pastries, their staged sorrow and subtle joy, they remind us that even grief must be eaten, digested, and turned into power. The king may be gone, but the table is still set. The early morning mist clings low over the fields. Dew beads on the leather saddles of waiting horses, hawks shuffle on gloved fists, and the hounds, sleek, muscled, and panting, are held just barely in check by their handlers. Somewhere in the distance a horn sounds. It's not the call to war. It's breakfast time, royal style, but not in the castle hall. Today the king is hunting, and that means a meal on the move. Medieval monarchs didn't just feast under gilded ceilings, they also dined on muddy paths, in woodland glades, and from saddlebags stuffed with surprisingly elegant fare. Welcome to the portable pantry of a king, the royal hunting expedition, where field snacks and game-to-table freshness took on a rugged romantic edge. The royal hunt was no mere hobby. It was ritual, recreation, and social strategy all rolled into one. Kings hunted to display prowess, to entertain visiting nobles, to bond with sons or impress daughters-in-law, and crucially, to reaffirm their dominion over land and beast. Only royalty and high nobility had the legal right to hunt certain game. Deer, boar, even hares were off limits to commoners. A peasant caught with venison might lose a hand. A king? He'd get roasted haunch served to him mid-ride with a splash of claret. But before the kill came the planning and the packing. Royal hunts often lasted all day, sometimes several days, and feeding the party in the field was a feat of logistics. The king's mobile kitchen, known as the bouche of court, would roll out ahead, setting up near expected resting spots. Portable ovens were erected, fire pits dug, and trestle tables prepared. Cold food was packed in wooden chests, swaddled in cloth, and hauled on carts or pack horses. Let's take a peek inside a typical royal hunting snack kit. There'd be thick slices of game pie, baked in a pastry crust so dense it could withstand hours of jostling. Meat pasties, filled with minced venison or boar and heavily seasoned to preserve flavour, were individually wrapped in linen. Dried sausages, spiced, smoked, and stuffed with fat, were easy to eat on horseback. Hard cheeses, waxed for storage, paired with coarse brown bread. For sweetness, small bundles of dried figs or honeyed almonds provided quick energy. And to drink, a flask of mead, ale, or watered wine, usually carried in leather vessels called costrals. And here's the quirky part. Kings often ate with specially made wooden spoons and knives engraved with their personal crest. Portable royal cutlery. Some even carried collapsible silver cups in velvet pouches, so their midday drink didn't have to suffer the indignity of being sipped from clay. As midday approached, the hunt might pause, not for rest, resting was for commoners, but to skin and dress the kill. A deer would be flayed and quartered on the spot by trained staff. Choice cuts, like the haunch and the saddle, were set aside for royal consumption. The rest might be left for the hounds, gifted to nearby monasteries, or salted for later transport. And if the hunt was successful enough, the field kitchen came alive. Fires blazed, spits turned, and the king might enjoy the freshest venison steak imaginable, still steaming from its woodland origin. Sometimes the carcass was roasted whole, smoke curling into the canopy as hawks circled overhead and the dogs gnawed discarded bones beneath the table. But it wasn't just deer. Falconry hunts, often led by queens and noblewomen, brought their own culinary culture. While the men chased boar and stag, women might dine in ornate pavilions on fine cloths laid over grass. Their meals included lighter fare, pigeon pies, sweet custards in travelling jars, rosewater wafers, and almond milk chilled in stone jugs packed with snow from deep cellars. And amidst it all, servants moved constantly, restocking, washing, watching the skies, because weather was a meal's greatest enemy. Rain could ruin bread, dampen fires, and send the royal appetite diving. That's why the hunt always included a fallback: cold collations. Cold collations were the medieval equivalent of a luxury picnic. They featured pre-cooked dishes designed to be served at room temperature. Roasted quail in vinegar sauce, pickled pike, hard-boiled eggs dyed with beetroot, and sealed jars of jellied meats, shreds of beef or veal suspended in aspic made from reduced stock and set with herbs, and always bread. Not the manchet of the feast hall, but rougher, darker loaves, dense enough to survive the journey and fill a hunter's stomach without slowing his aim. But meals in the field weren't just practical, they were political. Who sat near the king during the hunt break? Who got the best cuts of meat? Which guest's goblet was refilled first? These were the subtle dances of medieval court life. Even the manner of carving could be symbolic. The right to slice the first piece of game and hand it to the king, that was a job reserved for someone deeply trusted. There's one fascinating historical note. Richard the Lionheart was known for his near-maniacal passion for hunting, and records show that during his campaigns he would halt entire movements of troops just to stalk a stag. His hunting meals were often eaten sitting cross-legged on a fir throw, with guards forming a circle around him, the food handed in by silver-laden squires. His preferred field dish? Wild boar in vinegar with a side of mustard seed cheese. Not all kings were so rugged. Some preferred the hunt's pageantry to its blood. Henry VI reportedly took no pleasure in the kill, but delighted in the meal that followed. He would arrive late, dressed impeccably, and sit beneath a portable canopy of estate while roast fowl and honey cakes were served on delicate plates. His goblet bore a Latin inscription that read, "Let my cup bring peace, not fury." Still, the hunt was a chance for kings to bond with knights and nobles away from the formality of the hall. It offered moments of laughter, of shared exertion, of unguarded conversation between bites. A well-timed meat pie and a swig of wine could forge alliances more lasting than parchment and seal. Of course, not every hunting meal went smoothly. There's a story, likely apocryphal but beloved, about a Hungarian king who tried to impress a visiting Polish duke with a roasted elk feast mid-hunt. The dish was prepared with such haste that it arrived raw in the centre. The duke, mistaking it for some exotic foreign delicacy, bit in, smiled painfully, and declared it as firm as his host's honour. The line was remembered long after the meat was forgotten. Another tale from France recounts a king struck with food poisoning during a hawking expedition after eating river trout left too long in a leather pouch. His falconer had to carry him back to camp while the court physician scrambled for vinegar and thyme to purge the ill effects. Historians still debate how much of these stories are truth and how much court gossip fermented over centuries. But one thing is certain, the field meal mattered. It was nourishment, yes, but also narrative. So next time you imagine a medieval monarch, don't just picture him in a throne room with dripping roasts and goblets. Picture him in a sun-dappled glade, a linen cloth spread on the grass, a carved pie on a silver plate balanced in one gloved hand while the other holds a wine flask. Around him, the hounds pant. The hawks blink. The nobles laugh too loudly at a joke. And somewhere nearby, a cook stirs a pot over fire, humming a tune he learned as a boy. Because whether under a vault of stone or a canopy of leaves, a king's appetite must always be met. with skill, with speed, and with just enough splendour to remind everyone who, exactly, sits at the centre of the feast. The table is set, the platters gleam, and the meat steams softly under gold-threaded cloths. The feast is ready, the company gathered. But before anyone lifts a morsel to their lips, there's one final critical rule to remember. Don't you dare reach for a fork. To dine with a medieval king was to enter a highly choreographed world of table manners, social codes, and edible hierarchies. What you ate was important, yes. But how you ate, that could define your reputation, your status, even your loyalty. And in this peculiar etiquette, the absence of certain tools said more than their presence. Let's start with the fork. Today, it's the most unremarkable utensil imaginable, casually flung into dishwashers and lunch bags. But in the Middle Ages, especially in Western Europe, the fork was scandalous, downright suspicious. To many, it was considered both unnecessary and effeminate, a foreign affectation from Byzantium, where courtly elites dared to use two-pronged metal sticks to lift morsels of meat. In 1004, a Byzantine princess named Maria Argyropoulina shocked Venetian high society when she brought golden forks with her to Italy. She used them with dainty elegance to eat candied fruit. The local clergy were appalled. A bishop reportedly condemned her vanity, claiming that God had given humans fingers for a reason. When she died a few years later, of disease, not dinner, some claimed it was divine punishment for her unholy table habits. And so, in royal courts across Europe, kings continued to eat as their forebears had, with hands, but not bare hands. This is where things get oddly refined. A king, even elbow-deep in gravy, still observed rules. He used only 3 fingers, thumb, forefinger and middle finger, for grasping food. The other 2 remained curled, clean, symbolic of restraint. Cleanliness was paramount. Before and after every course, the king's hands were washed with scented water from a silver basin, offered by the ewer and received with ceremonial calm. Napkins, however, were not yet standard. Instead, kings wiped their fingers on pieces of bread, on their tunics, or more likely, on a carefully placed napery, a long strip of cloth draped across the table. Occasionally this led to interesting mishaps, like a guest accidentally dabbing his lips on the Lord Chancellor's sleeve, or a knight using a tapestry corner to blot grease, much to the horror of the steward. Each noble at table brought their own knife, long, pointed, and as useful for eating as for sudden duels. These were used to carve meat, spread sauces, and occasionally to gesture passionately in mid-debate. The idea of shared cutlery was common. Spoons were passed along the table, especially for pottage and stews. In fact, the word companion stems from companes, one who shares bread. Food was, at its root, communal, but don't mistake finger food for chaos. Royal table manners were rigid. You didn't slouch, you didn't talk with your mouth full, you didn't lick your knife, an especially egregious faux pas, and you certainly didn't reach across the table. The proper way to ask for salt or sauce, catch the eye of a servant who would pass it down a carefully observed chain, noble to noble, rank by rank, all the way to you. And speaking of salt, where you sat in relation to the salt cellar was everything. Above the salt meant near the high table, close to the king, where dishes were seasoned richly and conversations sparkled with wit and strategy. Below the salt, you were further down, in the dimmer corners of the hall, nearer the draughts, eating from trenchers that were a bit staler, drinking wine that might have been cut with water, and dodging dogs underfoot. Trenchers, those thick slabs of day-old bread used as plates, were the ultimate multitaskers. They caught drips, soaked sauces, and by meal's end were edible, if you dared, or, more commonly, given to the poor. This gesture of charity served dual purposes, feeding the needy and displaying royal magnanimity. Some trenchers were carved with religious motifs or courtly symbols, adding another layer of communication to every bite. Let's take a walk through a typical royal table setting, circa the 13th century. At each seat, a wooden or pewter trencher, a personal knife, a shared spoon, and a drinking vessel, either metal or horn. A napery ran the length of the table, with clean linen provided for the king. No forks, no plates in the modern sense, but plenty of hierarchy. As food arrived, it was always served to the king first, then to guests in descending order of rank. You did not eat until the king lifted his hand, you did not speak until he spoke, and you most certainly did not request seconds unless prompted. That said, kings often signalled generosity by offering portions of their own food to favoured guests. A slice of meat, a bite of fruit, a spoonful of pudding. To receive such a gift was both an honour and a test. You accepted it gracefully, praised it even if it was overcooked, and ate it, preferably without dripping juice onto your surcoat. Of course, things didn't always go smoothly. Medieval chronicles are peppered with tales of dining disasters, an ambitious noble who spilled his wine onto the queen's lap, a drunken jester who mistook the royal trencher for his own, a visiting duke who belched loudly after eating pickled eels and was never invited back. One bishop allegedly sneezed into a shared dish of honeyed carrots, causing half the table to suddenly develop urgent reasons to leave. And then there were the unwritten rules. How to hold your goblet, firm but not possessive. How to nod politely at a toast, no clapping, no exclamations. How to avoid letting your dog steal from your lap. Tie the leash to your chair leg, obviously. Even conversation had boundaries. It was acceptable to praise the food, compliment the host, or discuss noble lineage. Politics, risky. Religion, riskier. Jokes about the cook, never. One mainstream historical fact: etiquette manuals began to circulate by the late 14th century, advising nobles, and by extension their future kings, on proper behaviour. These guides often included delightfully specific advice such as, do not scratch your head with a spoon, or do not pick your teeth with your knife unless under a tree. Yes, trees were apparently exempt from manners. A fringe but fascinating tidbit comes from a 12th century German court, where guests were expected to sing a verse of poetry before each course. The king himself allegedly preferred guests who could rhyme in Latin. One unlucky knight, more gallant with a sword than a sonnet, reportedly tried to pass off a psalm as his own composition. The bishop saw through it, and the knight found himself dining outside next to the horses. So much of royal dining wasn't about food at all. It was about performance. A guest's manners could raise him into royal favour faster than a battlefield victory. A single careless gesture, chewing too loudly, wiping one's mouth on the tablecloth, might cost him dearly. Even women, though seldom seated at the highest tables, were judged with similar scrutiny. Their posture, their silence, their ability to peel a pear with a knife and not drip the juice. Everything was observed. Yet for all the rigid formality, the shared meal remained a source of warmth. After all, these were people, hungry ones. They laughed, they dropped things, they told stories. A king might tease a young page for forgetting the pepper, a queen might pass a dish of cherries to a visiting duchess with a wink. Children scampered beneath the benches, snatching crumbs and dodging servants. The great hall, for all its ceremony, was alive. Historians still debate the extent to which royal etiquette was enforced day to day. Some argue that the rules were flexible outside formal banquets. Others suggest that even casual meals were governed by the same codes, because the king was always in some sense on display. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. The high feast was theatre, but even in private, habits remained. A king's dignity was not a costume, it was a constant. So imagine this: a long wooden table, candlelight flickering on flagons of wine. The king, seated tall, takes a bite of honey-roasted partridge with 3 fingers, chews slowly, nods. The room waits. He reaches for his cup. The nobles relax. A young knight carefully wipes his fingers on the napery, not his sleeve. A lady dips bread into sauce, never slurping. Somewhere a dog growls as it's kicked away from a trencher. The meal continues, and all without a single fork. The flickering torchlight casts elongated shadows across the stone walls of the great hall, where the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine lingers in the air. At the high table the king reclines, his fingers delicately grasping a morsel of venison, while courtiers engage in hushed conversations, their voices blending with the soft strains of a lute. This scene, rich in sensory detail, is a testament to the intricate tapestry of medieval dining, where every gesture, utensil and morsel carried profound significance. In the medieval court, dining was not merely a matter of sustenance, but a performance of power, hierarchy, and decorum. The use of utensils, or the deliberate absence thereof, was laden with meaning. Forks, for instance, were viewed with suspicion in many parts of Europe, considered effeminate or even sinful. Their adoption was gradual, with Italy embracing them earlier due to the practicalities of consuming pasta, while other regions clung to traditional methods. Knives, often personal and ornate, were essential, serving both as tools for eating and symbols of status. Spoons, though more common, were still shared among diners, emphasising communal bonds. Neutralhistory.com, etiquette manuals of the time, such as the Book of the Civilized Man by Daniel of Beccles, provided guidance on proper conduct at the table. These texts underscored the importance of restraint, cleanliness, and respect for hierarchy. For instance, using only 3 fingers to eat was considered a mark of refinement, while overindulgence or loud behaviour was frowned upon. Such codes of conduct reinforced social structures and ensured that the dining experience remained a reflection of the court's values. nwikipedia.org +1 in wikipedia.org +1. The layout of the dining hall itself mirrored the societal hierarchy. The placement of the salt cellar, a valuable commodity, often delineated the boundary between the high-ranking individuals seated above the salt and those of lesser status below the salt. This spatial arrangement was more than practical. It was a visual representation of the social order, reminding all present of their place within the hierarchy. Meals were orchestrated with precision. The arrival of each course was signalled by specific cues, and the presentation of dishes was as much about aesthetics as taste. Subtleties, elaborate sugar sculptures depicting allegorical scenes, served as both entertainment and political commentary. These edible artworks conveyed messages about the king's power, virtues, or recent victories, turning the dining table into a stage for royal propaganda. The act of dining also involved a series of rituals. Hand-washing before and after meals was not only a matter of hygiene, but a ceremonial practice, often accompanied by scented water and fine linens. Toasting, too, held significance, with elaborate gestures and speeches reinforcing bonds among diners. These rituals fostered a sense of unity and reinforced the shared values of the court. medievalchronicles.com. Despite the emphasis on decorum, the dining experience was not devoid of warmth and camaraderie. Laughter, storytelling, and music often accompanied meals, creating an atmosphere that balanced formality with festivity. The presence of jesters, minstrels, and entertainers added to the conviviality, ensuring that the court's dining rituals were both structured and spirited. In essence, medieval dining was a microcosm of the court's broader societal structure. Every aspect, from the choice of utensils to the seating arrangement, was imbued with meaning, reflecting the values, hierarchies, and rituals that defined the era. Through the act of sharing a meal, the court not only nourished the body, but also reinforced the social fabric that held it together. The castle's great hall may have been a site of pageantry and power, but its royal table was also a battleground of wellness. Beneath the embroidered canopy, where kings dined on gilded venison and almond milk custard, lurked an uninvited guest, the medieval physician. Cloaked in learning, leeches, and a penchant for pessimism, this figure loomed large over every bite a monarch took. For in the Middle Ages, food wasn't just about pleasure, it was medicine, and royal diets were meticulously, if not obsessively, managed according to humoral theory. The prevailing belief of the time was that the human body consisted of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Health depended on keeping these in balance. Each humour was associated with qualities, hot or cold, wet or dry, and foods were believed to influence these properties. Too much roast beef? That's hot and dry, sure to aggravate yellow bile and lead to irritability. Melons? Cold and wet. Perfect to tame a fever, but risky in winter. And so, every royal meal came with a side of diagnosis. Doctors and dietitians, often the same person in varying robes, hovered behind the scenes, issuing instructions to the royal kitchen. They pored over astrological charts, noting whether Mars was in the ascendant and pronounced judgments accordingly. A good day for fish, they might say, but avoid salted herring. Saturn disapproves. One famous English king, Henry IV, reportedly had his entire week of meals prescribed based on planetary alignments. When Jupiter reigned, he was advised to eat chicken with sage. When Mercury dominated, he was warned against cabbage. The poor man couldn't lift a fork, not that he used one, without consulting the stars. Medical cookbooks existed too, some genuinely practical, others practically mystical. Recipes combined culinary instruction with vague medical aims. To cool a hot liver, one begins, take endive wine and boil with pearl barley. Another promises to lighten the spirits with a stew of crushed almonds, rosewater and sugar. Whether they worked is debatable, but kings, obsessed with health and longevity, rarely questioned the logic. And then there were the so-called restoratives, special dishes meant to rejuvenate, re-energize, or cure. One popular royal restorative was blancmange, shredded chicken or fish cooked with rice, almond milk and sugar. Soft, bland and smooth, it was considered easy on the stomach, excellent for balancing phlegmatic excess. Another was dragees, spiced sugar pellets taken after meals to close the stomach and freshen the breath. But not all medical advice was sweet. When kings fell ill, their diets became dramatically restrictive. Bread was scorched to remove mischievous damp, meat was boiled into thin broths, and the only spices allowed were those considered gentle to the gut. Heavy sauces disappeared. So did red meats and rich pastries. Even wine was diluted to the point of blandness, or replaced with infusions of fennel, dill, or wormwood. During recovery, the royal patient might be offered medicinal confections, tiny lozenges of herbs, honey, and sometimes crushed coral or ground pearl. And yes, you read that correctly. Some physicians believed powdered gems strengthened the heart and calmed the mind. Pearls soothed melancholy. Rubies stimulated circulation. Diamonds? Best avoided. They were thought to block the body's pores. One particularly strange remedy comes from the court of Charles VI of France. When suffering from insomnia, he was prescribed a syrup made from lettuce, vinegar and poppy seeds, stirred into warm beer and consumed at dusk. It allegedly worked, though he also believed he was made of glass at the time, so grain of salt. And if things got truly dire, a more extreme measure might be taken: the fasting cure. For several days, a king would consume only warm water and herbal tonics. No meat, no wine, no bread. Sometimes this was paired with bloodletting just to accelerate the balance. The results were mixed, but hey, if your court physician has a leech pouch and a book written in Latin, who's to argue? These practices weren't just reserved for moments of illness. Preventive diets were a constant concern. Certain foods were thought to prepare the stomach for larger meals. Apples, for example, were advised before a feast to scrape the innards. A sip of vinegar water before meat was said to sharpen the humours. And after meals, sweetened anise seeds or candied fennel were passed around to prevent indigestion, a medieval mint of sorts. Some monarchs became enthusiastic health foodies. Alfonso X of Castile ordered his kitchens to prepare separate digestive menus, with alternating courses of hot and cold foods to maintain bodily equilibrium. Frederick II of Sicily compiled his own food notes, advising which wines suited which meats, and even warning against combining fish with dairy, a rule some still swear by. A debate that still fuels scholarly squabbling. Did kings truly follow these strict regimens, or were they politely ignored once the physicians left the room? Some letters and journals suggest compliance. Others hint that the king's table had two menus, the official one, carefully noted by the clerks, and the real one, consumed when no one was looking. After all, who can resist roast goose basted in spiced wine, even if Saturn disagrees? Interestingly, medical advice often aligned with religious fasting rules. Both discouraged rich foods and excessive indulgence. A fast day meal of fish, pottage, and almond milk pudding might have pleased both bishop and doctor. But conflict sometimes arose. Physicians might recommend red meat for strength, while priests forbade it for the soul. Kings, as usual, found ways to compromise, usually by indulging in medicinal meats. Quirky anecdote break. King Philip of Navarre reportedly had a pet sturgeon, which he believed to be sacred and curative. Whenever he felt imbalanced, he would order the fish cooked and served with parsley and myrtle berries. It's said he once fasted for 3 days just to justify eating the sturgeon on a holy day, claiming it was prescribed. Even exercise was food-related. Kings were advised to walk after meals to aid digestion. Light hunting was acceptable, but jousting after roast boar? Risky. One medical text warns that violent movement upon full belly breeds ill humours and foul breath. In other words, let your meal settle before swinging a mace. Ultimately, the royal diet was a blend of indulgence and discipline, pleasure and precaution. A king could enjoy the richest dishes in Christendom, gold-dusted tarts, spiced pike, rosewater custards, but only if they didn't disrupt his bile. And with every bite he danced the line between delight and imbalance. Today we may chuckle at the thought of powdered rubies and liver-cooling lettuce, but the core idea persists. Food as medicine. The notion that what you eat affects how you feel is as medieval as it is modern. What's changed is the flavour, and, thankfully, the leeches. So the next time you sip herbal tea for your headache or reach for ginger to calm your stomach, remember the kings who walked before you, bloated on blancmange, blessed by Jupiter, and quietly wondering if maybe, just maybe, that sturgeon was the real cure all along. Trumpets blare, banners snap in the wind, and down the cobbled road thunders a cavalcade of knights, courtiers and cooks, yes, cooks, racing to prepare for the most theatrical feast in the medieval world, the coronation banquet. A king may be crowned by bishops and blessed with holy oils, but he is cemented in the hearts of his people by his ability to feed them. And so, on the day a crown changes heads, the kitchens roar louder than any choir. Coronation feasts were not meals, they were declarations, messages carved in jelly, alliances baked in pastry, and power poured from goblets. They served to remind the nobility, clergy, and commoners alike that the new monarch wasn't just legitimate, he was generous, mighty, and surrounded by abundance. You didn't just eat at a coronation, you beheld. Take the crowning of Henry IV of England in 1399. Chroniclers record that more than 10,000 people were fed across multiple halls, tents, and courtyards. 24 oxen, 300 sheep, and countless birds filled ovens the size of small cottages. Sweet wines poured from fountains, and desserts arrived shaped like castles, boats, and lions. Each course, there were over 12, was choreographed with military precision. Between them came dancers, acrobats, and costumed allegories of justice, faith, and England herself. The preparations began weeks, even months in advance. Royal kitchens were transformed into war rooms. Lead cooks, the master cooks, crafted preliminary menus, which then passed through stewards, physicians, and even the astrologers for final approval. The dishes had to reflect the king's heritage, religion, and ambition. If the king had recently won a battle, expect roasted boar with apple, symbol of victory and fertility. Was he young and untested? Look for lamb in rose sauce. Innocence, reborn, everything, even the bread, carried symbolism. Coronation loaves were often stamped with the royal seal, made from the finest flour and blessed by a priest before baking. Pies were decorated with heraldic beasts. Custards were dyed gold with saffron. In the centre of it all sat the royal subtlety, a massive sugar sculpture, usually depicting the king enthroned or defeating a dragon. It was not to be eaten, it was to be stared at, revered, but the true miracle? The logistics. Feeding thousands without electricity, refrigeration, or motorised transport required coordination that would make modern event planners weep. First, sourcing the ingredients. This wasn't done by running to the market. It involved royal purveyors, officers empowered to requisition goods from across the realm. Bakers, brewers, butchers, and beekeepers were all contacted. Some gave willingly, honoured to contribute. Others, not so much. There are records of farmers hiding livestock in cellars to avoid royal requisition. Then came the transport. Wagons creaked under sacks of flour, barrels of wine, and cages of geese. Live animals were preferred when possible. They kept better. So a road to the coronation might look like a livestock parade, with pigs in garlands and cows wearing bells. Next, the staging. Royal kitchens erected temporary outposts in the host city, often Westminster, Paris, or Naples, consisting of makeshift hearths, roasting pits, and enormous cauldrons suspended over fire. Tents were raised for chopping vegetables, others for storing spices and tools. There were even tents for pastry alone, cooled by wet cloths and packed with ice if it could be found. In some coronations, ice was shipped from mountain regions just to keep the jellies from slumping. And then came the staff. Hundreds of people were employed: cooks, servers, spit turners, taster boys, sauce boys, wine carriers, bread cutters, and food tasters. Yes, the risk of poisoning was so high at a coronation that entire teams of tasters were assigned. Each dish was sampled an hour before service, monitored, and only then approved. Timing was everything. The courses had to be hot, staggered, and served to different groups in strict order. The king and his closest advisers received theirs first, followed by dukes, lords, clergy, knights, ambassadors, and then, sometimes, the general populace. In some rare, especially generous coronations, open tables were set up in town squares, with oxen roasted whole on spits and barrels of beer provided in the name of the crown. But not all went smoothly. There were coronation disasters too. At the coronation of Charles VI of France in 1380, a kitchen fire nearly consumed the entire feast hall. It was reportedly caused by an overly ambitious subtlety involving a sugar-dusted phoenix whose wings had to be animated by live candles. The result? A small inferno, several scorched dishes, and a panicked relocation to the abbey's cloisters. The king, only 11 years old at the time, found it hilarious. The cooks did not. Another infamous case occurred at the coronation of Pope Clement VI, where a shipment of preserved fish went off during the journey. The smell overwhelmed the entire courtyard, and servants had to lay herbs on the floors and burn incense just so guests could eat without gagging. The fish was quietly buried behind the kitchens. The pie moulds, however, were reused for dessert, allegedly without cleaning. And then there's the tale of Richard II's coronation in 1377. Chroniclers describe an entire course made up of birds of the air, which included swan, peacock, partridge, quail, lark and heron, each seasoned uniquely, some refeathered for display. It was said that the king refused to eat the peacock, not out of morality, but because the pastry coffin it arrived in was too finely adorned to be breached. The dish was instead placed on a pedestal beside him as decoration. Curiously, these banquets often served as the debut for new culinary inventions. The coronation of Queen Isabella of Castile introduced silvered almonds, blanched nuts rolled in sugar and beaten silver leaf. Henry VIII's coronation featured early versions of marchpane, a proto-marzipan shaped like crowns and swords. And Louis IX of France insisted on a bread fountain, which turned out to be a layered cake from which wine was poured through a hidden tube. Historians still debate whether some of the grander feast accounts were exaggerated. Chroniclers had a tendency to glorify, but many records, including receipts and inventories, confirm the scale. When Edward III was crowned, royal kitchen rolls listed over 5,000 loaves of bread, 300 oxen, 100,000 eggs, and enough salt to keep Scandinavia in pickling for a year. Even more telling are the seating charts. These weren't just functional, they were political blueprints. The closer one sat to the king, the more influence they had. Coronation feasts solidified or shattered alliances. A noble relegated to the lower hall might see it as an insult. A bishop bumped up a row would sing praises for decades. Everyone watched where everyone else sat, and who ate what. There's also the role of entertainment. Coronation meals were never silent. Bards sang genealogical ballads linking the new king to biblical heroes. Dancers reenacted legendary victories. Jesters played pranks between courses, often at the expense of rival nobles. Sometimes, actors in allegorical garb would parade around the tables, virtue, justice, or the spirit of England, offering riddles or symbolic morsels. And when the feast ended, the clean-up began. Trestle tables were dismantled, linens bundled, bones gathered for broth, and leftovers distributed among the poor. This redistribution wasn't just charity, it was ceremony. It showed that the king's generosity reached beyond the noble class. It was a public relations move with real culinary follow-through. So what did a coronation feast taste like? Imagine a first course of heron pie, sweet, with dates and cloves. Follow it with boiled capon in almond milk, then spiced venison wrapped in leaves and baked in clay. Fresh oysters, seasoned with vinegar and pepper, arrive on flat stones. For dessert, crystallized violets, honeyed wafers, and an edible chessboard made of marchpane and fig paste. And wine, casks of Gascon claret, Malmsey sweet and rich, hippocras laced with cinnamon, and even snow-chilled rosewater for the Queen's cup. One final subtlety arrives, shaped like a tree of life with golden fruit and sugar-glass birds. The branches crack under a hidden mechanism, releasing rose petals over the guests. The crowd gasps. The king smiles. Coronation complete. The torches burn low. The clatter of pewter plates has faded. A final goblet of hippocras sits, half-sipped, on the arm of a throne now quiet. Somewhere in the shadows of the castle's vaulted ceiling, the echoes of the day's last feast linger in the rafters. Tonight, though, there is no banquet, no entertainment, no herald announcing the next course. For tonight the king dines alone. His final meal, chronicled by scribes or whispered by servants, is a ritual steeped in intimacy and myth. The so-called Last Supper of a medieval monarch was rarely a grand affair. It was private, intentional, and often tragically mundane, made poignant only in hindsight by the knowledge that no more meals would follow. Let us return for a moment to the court of Edward the Confessor. Not a warrior king, but a pious one, his final days were recorded with almost hagiographic precision. In the chill of early January 1066, as the bells of Westminster rang low and slow, Edward sat down to what would become his last known meal. Bread, a little wine, a soft egg, poached in almond milk and seasoned with parsley. Humble by royal standards, but rich in symbolism. His appetite was failing, they say. His mind, however, remained sharp. He spoke little, nodded to his servants, and dabbed his lips with a linen napkin as he always had. Some claim he whispered a prayer before taking the final bite. Others say he asked for the Psalms to be read aloud. Whether truth or legend, the image is striking. A king seated before a near-empty table, the flickering light casting halos across stone. Other royal deaths were less peaceful. Richard the Lionheart, struck by a crossbow bolt while besieging a minor castle in France, lingered in a tent as gangrene crept upward. His last recorded meal, a sip of watered wine and a piece of stale bread offered by his chaplain, it is said he refused meat, both in pain and in piety, insisting that his final acts be in accordance with penance. Historians still argue whether this abstinence was genuine religious devotion or the grim realities of a ruined gut. Then there's the tale of Charles IV of France, whose final feast included a dish of lampreys and garlic, possibly tainted. His health declined rapidly afterward. Some called it poisoning, others blamed the fish, a few blamed Saturn. Regardless, his death followed days of fever, with meals dwindling to broth, then water, then nothing. The lamprey dish was blamed in royal kitchens for years. Sometimes the final meal wasn't about death at all, but about legacy. At the end of his long, turbulent reign, Henry II of England reportedly dined alone in his fortress at Chinon. His meal, stewed eel, brown bread and a jug of rough wine. Simple, but telling. The man who had governed a vast empire, fought with his sons and waged war against a saintly archbishop, now ate in silence, his court abandoned, his friends few. When he died the next morning, they say his crown lay on a stool beside him, unnoticed. One fringe but compelling account comes from the court of Władysław II Jagiełło of Poland. Before falling ill with pneumonia, he is said to have eaten a tart of spiced cherries and cream, unusual for winter, but a favoured dish from his Lithuanian youth. He insisted on it, despite the kitchen's warnings. Whether it hastened his decline or simply marked a nostalgic indulgence, no one knows. But the recipe survived, passed down as the king's whim for generations. Even coroners and chroniclers found significance in these meals. A king's last supper was more than a curiosity. It was analysed, preserved, and often mythologized. Entire political tracts use these final meals as metaphors, gluttony as a symbol of weak rule, restraint as a sign of holiness. A monarch who died after roast duck and claret might be remembered as indulgent. One who passed after lentils and water could be painted a saint. Curiously, last meals were sometimes planned in advance. Certain kings kept testament menus alongside their wills, lists of foods they wanted served to their closest attendants on the day of their death. These were less about appetite and more about ritual, symbolic offerings to those who had served them, reminders of better days. A plate of pickled trout to thank a faithful steward, a honey cake for the page who brought it every epiphany, and after the king died the food continued. The death banquet, held days or weeks later, was its own chapter, as you may recall. But in the hours immediately following the final breath, the table was not abandoned. Instead, a symbolic meal was often laid at the king's place. Bread, wine, and sometimes a dish representing his coat of arms. Venison for England, duck for France, boar for certain German houses. It was eaten in silence by the heir and a few closest confidants. In one rare but documented case, a monarch's final meal was preserved in wax. The food was encased in resin and kept in a shrine-like container, displayed for a period of mourning. Visitors could gaze upon the last bread roll the king had touched, the cup he had held. It was a way to humanize the monarch, to remind subjects that even a king like them ended with a crumb and a sip. Historians often debate whether these last meals are truly accurate records or the products of creative monks and scribes trying to moralize history. Did the egg-poaching servants of Edward the Confessor really note the parsley? Did Richard's chaplain write down the state of his bread? Perhaps, perhaps not. But even as fictions, these meals reveal what the living wanted to believe about the dying. Food, after all, is memory, it is comfort, it is ritual, and nowhere is this truer than in death. Imagine then the final hours of a king. He sits quietly as the castle hushes around him. The courtiers are gone, the feast hall is cold. A single servant brings a cup of warm wine and sets it gently before him. There is no applause, no music, no spectacle. Just a bite, maybe two, maybe none at all. His fingers touch the rim of the goblet. He remembers the coronation feast, the hunting meals, the days of garlic-stuffed swan and gold-laced pudding. But now there is only this, one cup, one plate, one silence. And when the torches burn down and the servants whisper their prayers, the king slips into the stillness, full or fasting, triumphant or trembling, and leaves the table behind. The great hall is empty now. The fires have been banked, the silver polished and stored, the tapestries still as the air around them. Somewhere beyond the walls the last of the cook fires dies down with a sigh. In the quiet that follows such long, lavish days, after the trumpets, after the clinking of goblets, after the rustle of silk robes and whispered intrigues, only the echoes remain, and in those echoes lingers the taste of history. To dine with a medieval king was never simply about food. It was about power. It was about myth. It was about placing oneself bite by bite in the intricate web of symbolism, politics and belief. Every course had meaning. Every mouthful was a message. A roasted boar was never just pork. It was strength. A spiced pear was diplomacy and syrup. Even a modest bowl of almond pottage spoke volumes when served from the king's hand. The royal kitchen was not merely a place of preparation, but of transformation, of ingredients into allegory, of hunger into spectacle. And the men and women who worked behind its smoky walls wove those transformations with flower-covered fingers and fire-warmed brows, their labour shaping the myth of monarchy as surely as any battle or coronation. Even in fasting, the king feasted, on symbolism, on piety, on pageantry. And in his final meal, whether laced with saffron or nothing more than stale bread, he partook in a ritual that had stretched across centuries. The same balance of indulgence and humility, abundance and restraint, life and its inevitable dignified end. And now night settles over the stone towers and moss-covered walls of long-faded castles. The bells are silent, the goblets empty, the kings are gone. But their tables, they remain, in memory, in legend, in the soft details passed down like recipes, half whispered, half wished for. So rest now, traveller of time. Let the warmth of those hearths carry you into sleep. Dream of golden crusts and sweetened wine, of candlelit banquets and secret bites behind velvet curtains. Let the music fade, let the torches dim, and drift softly away with the final gentle rustle of a linen napkin folded at last.